Welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 21. Way back in Lesson 1, we talked about how ecological communities change. And in particular, we saw this example where Mount St. Helens had erupted in 1981, and then it basically created this complete barren zone of blowdown right near where the eruption happened. And there was nothing growing there. And even after 3 years, there was almost nothing growing there. But then if you came back 9 years later, you sort of started to see a few little green plants growing up through the cracks. You can see them if you look carefully. And then 15 years later, it was very obvious that there was a lot of greenery growing on the ground. In fact, there were even some small trees. 24 years later, the ground was quite covered. You have some larger trees, some big bushes. Again, almost the entire ground is covered in some grasses. 28 years later, even more, and so on and so on. And so we talked about how change was a constant in ecology. And today we're going to actually talk about change in a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about how communities and community composition and the abundances of different organisms in a community change through time. And so when we have changes in species composition of communities over time, we call this succession. Succession is the result of both biotic and abiotic agents of change. So one classic abiotic example is something like a forest fire. When a forest fire runs through the forest, it wipes out a lot of the organisms, a lot of the plants and animals that were living there. And as a result, for many, many years after that forest fire, you actually have the communities changing and evolving back to the point where they were before the fire burned through. So I remember going to Gatlinburg last weekend, or actually the first time I went back when I got to Clemson, and you saw a massive forest fire had wiped through Gatlinburg, and there's huge tracts of the forest that are just burned trees. And it'll take many, many years before those trees, that forest, that area, sort of returns to the state it was when I left Gatlinburg back about 8 years ago. And so again, that process of succession is going to be very slow. It's going to eventually occur, but those forests are not like I remember them before the forest fire. Another good agent of change, this time a biotic example, is bark beetles. So in Western Canada, in the last couple of years, we've had massive bark beetle outbreaks. And what these beetles do is they kill the lodgepole pine. And so that really changes the whole forest completely. They wipe through and entire patches of forest basically die. And so over the next 50 or so years, those lodgepole pine forests will return. They'll grow back. But it'll take time, and all the species that were there originally, sort of as part of that lodgepole pine forest, those will take a while until they return after the bark beetle outbreak. So within abiotic agents of change, there's sort of two categories. One is disturbances and the other is stress. Disturbance is an abiotic event that physically injures or kills some individuals, creating opportunities for others to grow. And so this actively removes particular animals or even the entire community from the landscape. So again, we can think about a forest fire. A forest fire kills the animals, kills the plants that were living there. It actively destroys them. And so here you see this picture of what happens after the forest fire wipes out the trees, and then you have not much there, and then some sort of annual plants come in, then grasses and perennials, and then grasses, shrubs, pines, young oak and hickory, and then finally you end up with your mature oak hickory forest. And you can see that that process after the fire, depending on the forest, can take many, many years. In this particular example, it takes over 150 years for the forest to return to its pre-fire state. And again, those of you who remember the fire in Gatlinburg, it'll probably take about that long for some of the regions to return to the state they were a couple of years ago before the fires occurred. So with biotic events, these can also be classified as disturbances. If the bark beetles actively kill the trees, they actively kill some of the types of animals or plants that live in that forest, that is a disturbance. Now, stress is a little bit different, and I know a lot of you think you know what stress is, but in biology, stress has a very specific definition. Stress is an abiotic factor that reduces the growth, reproduction, or survival of individuals, creating opportunities for other individuals. So it's not actively killing them, it's not actively wiping them out. It's not like a forest fire that just goes through and kills the plants. It's just sort of altering their demographic rates. So more of that population dies, or more of that population fails to breed, that sort of thing. And so here's an example of a stress. So in Antarctica, this is a system that my former advisor studied. What we're finding is that altered precipitation patterns in sea ice isn't actively killing different species of penguins, but it's not really good, it's not conducive to Adelie penguin survival and reproduction. And so because of that, the Adelie penguins tend to be decreasing. They're breeding less, they're having fewer babies when they do breed. They're probably not surviving as long as adults. And so we're seeing that population drop down, and that altered sea ice and altered precipitation is a stress for the Adelie population. And as a result of the Adelie population dropping, we're seeing the Gentoo penguins sort of increase rapidly in abundance, and they're actually aided by the sea ice changes. All right, so again, those are the two sort of types of abiotic changes. We can also classify change, both abiotic and biotic, as in terms of intensity, and that's the severity or the amount of damage and death that's caused. So typically, something that forest managers do is they do what's called a controlled burn. In fact, at one of my field sites out in Gatlinburg, we went back last weekend and we found that the rangers had done a controlled burn. And the typical controlled burn is what we would call low intensity. The sort of area that is burned is contained, the heat of the fire is contained to maybe not kill all the stuff there, just the underlying shrubbery. And people do this in forests to try and get rid of the sort of underlying dead wood that might cause a bigger burn. Now, on the other end, we have sort of high-intensity forest fires, like what happened in Gatlinburg, where tons of people were killed. Or not tons of people, but a number of people who lived in Gatlinburg were killed. Large tracts of the forest were completely wiped out. And not just the underlying shrubbery, the entire forest, the trees right down to the bare rock. And so that's high intensity. Another example is the Camp Fire that happened back in 2018. Again, that was high intensity both in terms of the number of humans killed and the wildlife consequences, the amount of acreage burned, the sort of amount of the forest that was destroyed during that burn. So that's intensity. We can also think about frequency. So again, different regions of the country burn at different rates. California is pretty much always on fire, whereas we look at the East Coast and we don't have fires. In fact, you look at where Gatlinburg is, and that's sort of the edge of Tennessee, and you see that the understory fire should burn somewhere between once every 34 years. But we don't have these massive, complete forest fires. Just the understory should be burning just a little bit and fairly infrequently. And so what happened in Gatlinburg was really rare, and it was really rare both because of weather events, it was very dry, because that understory had built up quite a bit more than maybe it should have, because it had burns had been suppressed for many years. That is why the forest managers do tend to do these small control burns to try and get rid of that fuel, because if they don't, you have that you don't have the frequency of the little fires that burn the undergrowth, but you have sort of this infrequent massive burns. So again, we can think about how often this agent of change, something like a forest fire or a volcano, how often that happens, and also how intense when it happens it is. Both frequency and intensity matter to ecological communities. And so you have this spectrum, and on the one end you have infrequent high intensity events where the entire community is affected, and recovery basically involves this complete putting together of the community from scratch, basically from nothing, because everything is gone. And then at the other end you have sort of frequent low intensity events, and these are more subtle. Maybe you burn a little bit of the grasses, but then they grow back pretty quickly and the rest of the forest remains intact through the process. And so these frequent low intensity events, they can open up patches of resources, little areas here or there, maybe a tornado blows through and wipes out, a couple of meters of a forest. So that opens up little patches that can be used by others, but it's not this massive, widespread event where everything in the forest is completely destroyed. Typically, when we're thinking about succession, we think about it as a trajectory. We start in one place and we move through this sort of stereotypical process to some other place. And the place that we start is at the very beginning is with no life, and then we move to the pioneer stage, the intermediate stage, and the climax stage. And depending on the frequency and intensity of your events that cause change, that cause return to an earlier point in this trajectory, you may go back all the way to the beginning to where there's nothing living there, or you may go back to sort of a slightly further along state like the pioneer stage or the intermediate stage. So the pioneer stage is that primary stage, it's that first community to appear after sort of bare rock, after you've been wiped down to nothing. And it's that community that develops in the early years after that very new, very completely devoid of life habitat appears. The opposite end of the spectrum is the climax stage. That is the stable endpoint. So once you're at the climax stage, the community basically remains completely the same or mostly the same for many, many years or for very long periods of time until some kind of agent of change, some kind of disturbance sends the community back to an earlier stage. So in succession, we can sort of distinguish two types depending on where you get kicked back to, where you start in that trajectory. So if you start all the way back to the beginning at bare rock, and then you move forward from there, we call that primary succession. So that's sort of the colonization of habitats that are completely devoid of life, either because of a catastrophic event, maybe the forest fire was so intense that nothing, absolutely nothing survived, only the rock survived. A good example is with Mount St. Helens, near the blowdown area, nothing survived. There was nothing left in that area. You can also have bare rock exposed because of newly created habitats. Say you had a volcano go through and some big volcanic rock ends up sort of deposited in an area. That may not have killed anything per se in the area, but it's newly exposed rock. It's newly exposed habitat with nothing living on it. If your disturbance was not as intense and it left some stuff still around, then we call that secondary succession. So this is reestablishment starting from a community where not everything has been destroyed. Most has been destroyed. Maybe a few little grasses, some soil with some sort of detritus and like some of the soil organisms growing in there. Maybe that's been left, but a lot has been destroyed. We certainly aren't at that stable final stage, but we aren't all the way back to the beginning either. So that's secondary succession. All right. So again, we can think about succession as primary succession, secondary succession. Primary succession sort of starting from the beginning, secondary succession starting from an earlier point, but not all the way back to the beginning. And then we end up at that final stage, that climax community, where we have little successional change. And depending on the frequency and intensity of our disturbances, that puts us into different states for succession, different, whether we're going from primary succession, secondary succession, to sort of not really any succession at all, just tiny little changes that are almost at equilibrium. I open up a patch here and it gets colonized, open a patch here and gets colonized, and those little open patches are almost part of that final end state. So this is a figure that shows how intensity and frequency relate to the different types of succession or where you are in that succession trajectory. The size of the dots represent the amount of biomass that's removed by the event, and the number of dots represent sort of how often it's happening. So on the one end, I can have high intensity, low frequency events. So I'm going to remove a lot of biomass, that big circle at the top there, but I'm doing it very infrequently. So, it's happening once. When that happens, typically I'm going back right to the beginning of that succession trajectory. I'm starting primary succession. I've removed everything. I could also have sort of a low frequency, low intensity event. That's that bottom left little circle. There's one circle and it's really little. In that case, it's not really succession. Again, that's sort of the equilibrium state of the forest. I remove a tree here because it falls and dies. I remove 2 trees here because they got, a beetle in them, but not a big beetle outbreak, just a little beetle killed them. And, 1 tree here or there gets removed. That's just the normal state of the forest. So that's not really part of succession. That's sort of part of the end state. So low frequency, low intensity, we don't really have succession going on. In the middle, I can have sort of intermediate intensity and intermediate frequency. So that's going to happen quite commonly, and it's going to remove a sizable amount, but not everything. And so that boots you back to an earlier starting place, but not all the way back to the beginning. So that's sort of putting you back to secondary succession, and then you move forward to the final state. Then you can have high frequency, low intensity events, and again, that's very much like the low frequency, low intensity. It's little things disappearing here or there, but that's just kind of normal for the end state of the forest. No community is completely stable with all the trees always living and all the animals always living. Things die here and there and create little open patches, but that's just the way the forest is. And so again, when we have high frequency, low intensity, we don't really have succession going on. That's just more keeping you at that end state. So you might wonder why I have no pictures up in that top right corner. That's because once we get there, communities can't exist, right? You can't have communities living where I have high frequency, high intensity events. It's just impossible to kick you back to the bare rock all the time and have anything manage to eke out a living there. So, in regions where you have high frequency, high intensity disturbances, you don't really get anything growing. It pretty much remains bare rock forever. So again, we have those sort of different stages of succession, either primary succession that kicks you all the way back that you get after the low frequency, high intensity events, secondary succession that kicks you partway back that you get after intermediate frequency, intermediate intensity events, and then no succession, just sort of that's just the way the forest is. Of course, everything's always changing, but nothing big enough to make it sort of a different kind of community. That's what you get when you have low intensity events, whether they're frequent or infrequent. All right. A lot of the early work on succession was done on plants. And that's largely because succession was studied by botanists, people like Cowles, Clements, and Gleason. And so the sort of opinion was that succession was driven by the plants. The land was completely, wiped out, bare rock was exposed, and it was the plants that came in and set up the habitat, and sort of what happened to the plants kind of determined what would happen to the animals. So as the plants went from those annuals to the perennials to the shrubs to the trees all the way up, then the different animals came in and colonized, but they were sort of passive followers of this colonization process. The animals that could live in grasses came in when the grasses arrived, the animals that could live in shrubs came in when the shrub arrived, and the animals that needed trees only came in when the trees arrived. Charles Elton, though, actually showed that the animals play a role too. They actually come in and change the environment in ways that determines how that environment's going to progress, how that trajectory from primary succession through secondary succession to the end state, how that happens and where the community ends up. They matter. So that brings us to thinking about how does succession happen, right? We've talked a lot about, in the last unit, species interactions, and then in the last lesson we talked about communities and how the way communities are really depends on the species in them and the species interactions that are happening there. So, if I have different competition interactions, that determines who can live together, who can coexist, and what the community is going to look like. And so we should actually think about species interactions when we think about succession too. If it matters to communities, and it matters to end state communities, and it matters to who lives where and who can coexist with whom, then species interaction should matter for that succession, for that trajectory process as well. So scientists aren't entirely sure of how species interactions matter to succession, and probably species interactions matter differently in different regions to the succession process. But very broadly, we can divide the way species interactions occur and how that impacts succession into three broad models. So the first model is the facilitation model. And the idea here, or the theory here, is that the earliest colonizers change the environment. They modify it in ways that benefit species that come in later. And so that sort of sets the groundwork for the later colonists. Unfortunately, the way that the early colonists modify the environment, it actually hurts them. And so it sort of prevents them from continuing to maintain that area. And so you get this change from species A to species B to species C to species D, because species A makes the habitat good for species B but bad for itself, and it dies out and species B comes in. And then species B makes the habitat good for itself, but then it dies out makes the habitat good for species C but bad for itself, and so it knocks itself out and species C takes over. And then species C makes the habitat really good for species D, but bad for itself. And so it wipes itself out, and then species D takes over. And then once you get to the species that doesn't really destroy the habitat for itself, that's your final state, that's your climax community. So one example, species A could be something like lichens, and they, bare rock. It's hard for a tree to grow on bare rock. There's nothing to put its roots into, right? So obviously trees can't grow on bare rock. In fact, not much can because there is no soil. But lichens do. And so lichens come in and they sort of colonize that bare rock. And then as they grow and live and die and form detritus, they actually produce soil that allows the next thing to come in. And so eventually the forbs come in and grow. The soil is thick enough that they can grow their roots into it. But that soil is kind of crappy soil, right? It's not got a lot of nutrients because the lichens started from bare rock. It didn't have much to go on. And so other things can't really grow in there except for forbs. And forbs can only do that because they can actually fix nitrogen from the air. So they don't need nutrient-rich, nitrogen-rich soil. And so they can come in. So they wipe out the lichens. They come into this sort of poor soil, and they actually begin to add nitrogen to that soil. And they also add depth. And so all of that nitrogen now allows a new species to come in and take over and wipe out the forbs. And so in this case, bushes can come in because now there's enough nutrients in the soil, there's enough nitrogen in that soil because of the forbs that the bushes can grow. And so they come in and they start growing. The soil's still kind of bad because it's sort of dry and it doesn't hold water. And so that makes it hard for trees to grow. But then when the bushes come in, they actually trap the water in the soil, and that allows the trees to come in. And so then eventually we get the trees taking over and wiping out the others, or at least reducing the abundance of the others. So again, those early colonists, the species A and species B, are good at colonizing open habitats. They're good at colonizing sort of those habitats that haven't got a lot of going on. So they tend to be good at dealing with physical stresses and ameliorating harsh conditions. When we get to the final climax communities, those guys are not necessarily good at dealing with open habitats. They're not good at dealing with physical stress. They're not good at dealing with sort of limited nutrients, low water necessarily. So they need those early colonists to fix the environment. What the later colonists are good at is competition and out-competing those earlier guys. They kind of take over. So the big trees can shade out a lot of the other stuff, and so they are the ultimate winners in competition. So that's the facilitation model. The next model is what's known as the tolerance model. So here the idea is that the earliest colonizers modify the environment, but in neutral ways. So, they change it, but they don't make it better either for themselves or for other species. It's really sort of, it doesn't matter. It's changed, but it doesn't really matter. And so, you might get grasses that come in as species A, and they come in quickly early on, not necessarily because they're good at dealing with the harsh environment and the bare rock, but because they have a lot of wind-blown seeds that reach the area quickly. Remember, if you think back to some of our earlier lectures, they're like the ruderals. They're the grasses. They sort of just have lots of babies, and they go a lot of places quickly, and that allows them to colonize areas because they're weedy. The next thing you might have is something like invasive bushes. They reach the site almost as quickly because, again, they're kind of weedy species. They're more like ruderals. They're getting their seeds everywhere. And so they come in. And so the grasses have modified the environment, but not in any way that helps grasses or that helps these invasive bushes. They've just modified the environment. And the invasive bushes come in later, not so much because the environment's better for them now, but because it takes them a little longer to get to the site. Maybe they have a little bit of heavier seeds, so they don't disperse as quickly, or they make fewer seeds, so they're just less likely to get there as the first things. And then we move on, and trees come in, but only the trees with small seeds that can disperse well. And so those trees come in, and they might shade out the bushes and remove those bushes so that you're getting this trajectory of some things coming in first and then getting wiped out, same as we saw before, but they're not being wiped out because they're fixing the environment for the things that come later. They're just being wiped out because the later stuff is better competitors, but it's having more trouble getting there, right? It's not so much that the environment's made better for the later colonizers. It's that the later colonizers just don't get there as fast, so they show up later to the party. And then finally we get the trees with the big heavy seeds. They're not good at dispersing, but they are good at out-competing everything else, so they get rid of the other trees and eventually take over. But again, it's not because the environment's been made any better for them, it's just that they took a while to get there. So that's the tolerance model. And again, with the early colonists in the tolerance model, you have life history strategies that allow them to grow and reproduce quickly and disperse easily. So that allows them to get to this new habitat quickly. They're the first ones that get there. And then with the later species, you have life history strategies that involve slower growth, fewer offspring, and a longer life that allows them to outcompete the early colonizers, but they just don't, again, get to the party quite as fast. The final model for succession is the inhibition model. And in this model, the early successional species do modify the environment, but not in good ways for the next species. They actually modify the environment in ways that hinder the later successional species. And so in this case, everybody's busy hindering everybody else. So here's an example of the inhibition model. So we might have green algae, and it's again a rapid colonist, so it kind of arrives early, it gets there fast, and it grows there. So that's the first thing you see in sort of your going from primary succession, going from bare rock. But the green algae actually produces a toxin that inhibits all the other algae. It's not making the rock better by creating soil. It's actually making the rock worse by producing a toxin. But eventually, other things come in. The animal community comes in, and it grazes on the green algae, and that produces some space for the red algae. And so then the red algae come in and inhibit the green algae and take up some space. But then again, they also produce some toxins that sort of prevent other species from colonizing that rock. So again, they're somewhat preventing the green algae, and they're preventing anything later from colonizing. So again, it's negative interactions all the way around. But, every so often the red algae is whipped off by the action of rocks, and so that makes some space for something like mussels. And so the mussels come in and they take up some space, and they, because of their just physical bulk, they prevent green algae from colonizing that area, and they also prevent red algae because they're just taking up space and the algae can't get in underneath of them. And so again, the mussels are busy inhibiting all the algae, and that they also take up space for anything else that might want to come onto the rock. But then, maybe some diseases sweep through and wipe out spaces in the mussel bed, and then that makes space for barnacles that come in a little bit later. And then the barnacles, again, just take up physical space, and they prevent algae from growing on that space, and they prevent mussels from growing on that space, and they prevent basically everything else from growing on that space. And so again, you have negative inhibition all the way around. So in this particular model, your early colonists have life history strategies, again, that allow them to reproduce quickly and disperse easily, kind of like in the tolerance model, but the difference is in the inhibition model, they're kind of preventing everything else from coming in, and it's sort of these random events that make the spaces, not so much that the other things coming in are sort of following a trajectory. And then your later colonists have life history strategies that involve sort of long-term competitive success. They're better at out-competing the other stuff, not necessarily short-term competitive success. So, long-term, when a patch opens up, mussels are more likely to take over than algae, or barnacles are more likely to take over than mussels. And so that's how you get that trajectory towards your final different end state. So those are the three models for succession. This is a figure from your book, and it kind of just summarizes all the different processes and all the sort of how that trajectory from primary succession through secondary succession to the climax community occurs for the three different models, for the facilitation model, the tolerance model, and the inhibition model. Now, in reality, no single model perfectly fits any one community. In fact, there's probably facilitation going on to some extent among some of the species that are early colonists moving towards later colonists. But then there's probably also tolerance where some of those early colonists don't help some of the other later colonists at all. If it's kind of neutral, they change it, but they don't help it. And then we probably also have some species in there, especially later on, but even early on, where you have, they're inhibiting later stuff from coming on. So in a big complex community, you probably have facilitation interactions, for some species that enable other species to come in. You probably have interactions that are sort of processes that don't matter at all between species, and you have negative interactions between early and late colonists. So again, within a single community, different species are probably following different parts of these models, and the community as a whole isn't really one process or the other. In general, though, even though we do have this facilitation model, the tolerance, which is kind of neutral, and then inhibition, so the positive to neutral to negative kind of three models, in reality, when we think about the process through time, we do tend to have facilitation mattering more early on and inhibition mattering more later. So when I'm early on, I have low species diversity, but I have a really harsh environment. And so because it's just so physically stressful to live in that environment, to make it, it's almost impossible to grow on bare rock. Facilitation interactions probably are more important early on. But then as I get to the sort of climax community where I have that higher species diversity and it's not a really harsh environment, it's lots of thick nutrient rich soil, I don't have anything terrible going on. In that environment, facilitation maybe isn't as important, and so you get larger, more competitive species taking over, inhibiting the others, and so inhibition does become more common in those later stages. But again, in this climax community, typically you're going to have really high species diversity, and anytime that's true, you probably got both positive and negative interactions. Some species are mutually interactive; they're exhibiting mutualisms and they're helping each other. Other species are probably exhibiting competition and outcompeting each other, and that's what's causing the sort of progression. Again, when we look at succession, from that primary succession with the pioneer stage communities through to secondary succession with the intermediate stage communities all the way to the climax community, what we have is a trend towards increasing species diversity. There's not a lot of species living on the bare rocks. There's a ton of species living in that final, stable, untouched forest. Now, one trick with succession is that you might go back to the beginning, but you don't always end up at the same end. And so depending on the system and depending on the disturbance and depending on exactly what happened when during that trajectory that is succession, sometimes different communities go to different places. And so this is an example in people in the gut where people underwent an ileostomy, and they looked at what happened to the bacterial communities after that ileostomy over time. And they were interested in that because it really had what happened to the bacterial communities and how the bacterial communities evolved really determined the sort of outcome for the patient. Because a certain gut community in their a certain community of microbes in their stomach was good for them and helped with survival, and a certain gut community in their stomachs was not good for them, and those patients tended to die. So they cared, and what they found was that if they had this ileostomy performed, then some patients ended up with sort of a whole pile of Clostridia and Bacteroides, and that was good. That was typically associated with strong survival, the examples that are in the green box. But if they had instead sort of a lot of lactobacilli and enterobacteria, they ended up with bad outcomes more often. They ended up with people dying. And so what they found is that really which way you went, whether you ended up with a good final community or a bad final community, depended on how much oxygen you had in that system as the ileostomy closed. And if you had sort of high enough oxygen, then you ended up with that good normal community where the patient survived. And if you had less oxygen, you ended up with that bad community where the ileostomy did not close, and it unfortunately frequently the patients died. So again, these small changes at certain sensitive periods during the succession process can cause you to go one direction or the other, can cause you to end up in one end state or the other. And sometimes that means we just get different forest types in one place versus the other. Sometimes in the case of humans, where the community is the microbes living in your stomach, it determines your survival or not. Now, we've seen alternative stable states before, right? We've seen that in our Loca-Volterra competition model. So when different communities develop in the same area under similar environmental conditions, but you end up with sometimes one species, sometimes the other, what we saw was that if I sort of drew my Loca-Volterra diagram like this, if I started down here with sort of a lot of species 1 and very little species 2, I would go to all species 1. And if I started up here with a whole lot of species 2, but not so much of species 1, I would end up with all species 2. And so, again, this is what we called bistability. Either species 1 ended up at its carrying capacity and species 2 was driven extinct, or species 2 ended up at its carrying capacity and species 1 was driven extinct, depending on initial conditions, depending on what you started with. And so that's an example of alternative stable states. And that's sort of what can happen with succession. If you just sort of have a couple more colonists of one species than another, and they're competitors that exhibit this sort of bistability in their Locke-Volterra interactions, then, just depending on who arrived first by chance, one community could go one way and the other could go the other. So this is a classic example of alternative stable states. We've actually seen another in the harvesting model. So remember, if I'm harvesting, right, if I've got a population size of about 65, the population will sort of settle there and stay there. In fact, if I start at any population above about 25, I will end up with a stable population of fish at about 65 fish, as long as if I harvest at that blue harvest line. But if I start with any population below 25 fish, then ultimately the population is going to go extinct and that fish is not going to be present in the community anymore. And so again, this is an example of bistability. Depending on where I start, even if I do the exact same thing, I end up in different places. I end up with the fish population stable at 65, or I end up with the fish population going extinct. And so stability is this really critical idea to community ecology. And a community is said to have stability or to be stable when it remains in its or when it remains or returns to its original structure after some perturbation. And so stability depends on spatial scale. What we call stable really depends on how big of an area we're looking at. If I think about small scales, then, the system may not be super stable because, oh my gosh, I wiped out a little patch of forest and that, that completely changed and now I'm ending up at a slightly different place because a slightly different colonist came in there. But then if I look at a larger scale, on average, maybe oak took over this patch and pine took over this patch, and the next time I knock it out, pine takes over the first patch and oak takes over the second patch. If I look over a larger scale, I've got about half oak and half pine, but on the small scale, I'm actually getting totally different communities, just sort of with, depending on whether oak takes over or pine takes over. But over the large area, on average, nothing's really changing. 50-50 is oak and 50-50 is pine. So again, because of that averaging effect, larger spatial scales tend to yield smaller changes, tend to seem more stable than when I'm looking at smaller scales where sort of that stochasticity can really matter. Temporal scale can also matter in terms of whether something appears stable or whether we call it stable or not. So again, with short times, things may look like they're unstable. With short time scales, things may look more stable. If we come in and we sort of think about, the experimental forest has looked the same for the last 10 years, right? Nothing's really changed. It's sort of stable, right? But then if we look over larger time scales with glaciations or mass extinctions, if we think back to the Ice Age, the experimental forest was very different. So again, that's a case where, from year to year, the experimental forest looks stable, but from, millennia to millennia, maybe not so much. The magnitude of the perturbation or the disturbance can also determine whether the system sort of appears to be stable or not, or whether we sort of think of it as stable. So small changes are unlikely to bump a system out of its existing state. So it's sort of at some stable equilibrium. But then big changes are likely to cause some complete dramatic change. And the best way to understand stability, particularly bistability, is sort of a picture with this well. And so if you think about it, if I have a little change, if I just kind of move this a little bit, the ball will roll right back down to its original starting place. And so that's where small perturbations tend to cause the system to not change too much. The system returns to its original state. But then if I think about large perturbations, right, you can knock it over that middle hump and then you end up with a totally new place. So with large perturbations, you're much likely to return to a different state. So this brings about the idea of hysteresis. Hysteresis is the inability to shift back to the original community type even when the conditions or the original conditions are restored. And again, we've seen hysteresis. We haven't called it that, but in the last unit we saw hysteresis. So you remember this fisherman fishing at 68, fishing at a rate of sort of 2.5 and having a fish population stable at about 68 fish. And then he fishes a lot more and the fish population plummets and he says, uh-oh, what have I done? And he goes back to the original harvest level. He goes and returns to the original conditions, but it turns out now the fish population is so low that he can't harvest at that rate and still get the population back to 68. The population does not return to its original state, even though he's returned to the original harvest condition. And that's because of that sort of, because now the population is so low that it's not replacing fish at the rate that he's harvesting at. And so the fish population will drop. And so now he says, oh, but I was able to harvest at 2.5 fish before. Why can't I anymore? And it's because of hysteresis. So again, hysteresis, this is a sort of more conceptual picture of hysteresis from your textbook. We start with a community in one state, and there's that bistable well I showed you, and we give a big perturbation, big enough to pop it into another state, and then a sort of small perturbation where you try and get it back to its original state, a perturbation the same size that you did to pop it into the new state, it just doesn't move it back. I try and sort of pop it back with the exact opposite perturbation, and it doesn't go there. So why does hysteresis matter? Well, if we could always go back to the original state by doing what we were doing before, we wouldn't worry quite so much about some of the stuff that humans do to the world. But unfortunately, we don't always know where these sort of points of no return, where they're going to happen. They can kind of come up to us blind, and we think, I can push it, I can push it, I can push it, and you're basically pushing that ball a little bit further up the mountain every time, and you don't know when you're going to pop it over and not be able to get it back. And so human activities are shifting communities to alternative steady states, and they're doing it through things like habitat destruction, introducing new invasive species, overharvesting. We saw that classic example of hysteresis in the overharvesting model. And unfortunately, when we do this, we can alter the communities in ways that change it permanently and make it almost impossible for us to return to the original state. Other things we can do is we can remove or add important keystone species or strongly interacting species, and that can really change the entire community, right? We saw that removing the wolves completely changed the community in Yellowstone, and then putting them back in, it changed it back. Now, if we'd left them out longer, would we have ever been able to return to the original state? Who knows? Maybe in that system we would, but in other systems we know we can't. And so when we alter these communities, when humans do things to alter these communities, we call that regime shifts. When we have a totally different new process going on, we have a totally different new community because of something we've done, then we call that a regime shift. And the question is, can we ever get back? So sometimes maybe we can. Sometimes we can restore the original conditions and go right back without any problem. Sometimes we have to sort of overcompensate, like fish a lot less than we could before, so we're not returning to the original condition, we're actually doing something even more drastic, but we can still get back. Sometimes, though, we've gotten to the point of no return and we can't get back at all. And so that's what we need to start thinking about when we modify the environment. We modify it through species destruction, and unfortunately, when we modify it through climate change. You hear a lot of people talk about tipping points in climate change, and that's the idea of when we've pushed so far that we can't get back. We've sort of popped into this new outcome, which is probably not a good outcome for us, and no matter what we do, we can't get back. We can't return to that original state that we were sort of happy with. All right, so that's our introduction to succession, which is a process that happens to communities. And if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to email me. Otherwise, I will see you in the next lecture.